During the 14th and the 16th century, Poland was one of the most powerful political formations in Central and Eastern Europe. Then, undergoing a progressive dismemberment, it disappeared as a state, following 3 successive divisions between Russia, Prussia, and Austria, which took place in 1772, 1793, and 1795. In 1815, the Congress of Vienna reconstituted the Polish state, entrusting control of it to Tsarist Russia, which carried out a terrible oppression in the country. Strengthened by strong independence pushes culminating in the uprisings of the 1830, 1831, and 1863, Poland was reconstituted as an independent state after the First World War, under the leadership of General Joseph Pilsudski, who between 1926 and 1935 established a dictatorial regime. In 1939, at the beginning of Second World War, it was invaded by Germany and soon after by the Soviet Union. The years of war and occupation were dramatic for the country, which suffered heavy human losses, especially in the Jewish component of the population, massacred in ghettos and in numerous Nazi extermination camps, including that of Auschwitz. The Germans were driven out of Poland by the Soviets, who, at the end of the conflict, established their own control over the country. After the elections of 1947, the Communists took power and abolished any party pluralism. Poland, thus, became a Soviet-style country fully integrated into the political and military system of the USSR, despite the extensive demonstrations against the regime that developed in the following decades, in particular after the starts of de-Stalinization in the second mid-1950s. Since then, Poland has embarked on a complex transition to democracy and a market economy in a context of political instability and social tensions that have strongly eroded the consensus towards the Solidarnosc and Valenza that has been president of the Republic from 1990 to 1995.
Women activists during the Holocaust have been variously memorialized as virtually mythic heroic girls and as career girls. The true description of women's role during the Jewish underground may lay somewhere between these two extremes. All of these women were active members of the leadership, they had influence in the decision-making processes, and they were leading figures in the resistance operations. One of the main reasons was probably the relative egalitarian and anarchist characteristics of the relative movements. Most of the movements were radical socialists or bore the impact of socialism in one way or another, and the equality of women within social frameworks was taken for granted since it derived from the idea of equality among all human beings. The ongoing occupation and the ghettos necessitated the creation of a new functionary, an emissary or delegate Shalila or Shalia of the central leadership. This role was filled mainly by females because of the danger of the circumcision test at the German checkpoints. In short, they had to personally represent the central leadership, its ideas, programs, and operations. The Shalila functioned much more like a high-ranking staff officer in a military organization than as an underground career, just like Tosha Altman, who had a leading position and acted as authorized representative of the central leadership. We are going to talk about her later. Although men occupied most of the command position, units that participated in the Warsaw Uprising was led by a woman. In several cases, women did serve as commanders. For instance, Rodzka Korczka was the commander of an important position in the Vilna ghetto. Wicka Kepner-Kovner led small units on railway sabotage operation in the Vilna ghetto and forests. And Zivia Luptakin led the escape through the sewers from the burning Warsaw ghetto. Moreover, the first delegates to the German-occupied area of Poland from Vilna and Russian-occupied Poland were women. The individual youth movement groups served as a fraternity or small family in which an emotional attraction common to both sexes in the group was a crucial factor. In fact, the intimate group functioned like a family, which had not only its brothers and sisters but also its father and mother. These were the male and female youth leader, respectively, who represented parental figures for the youngsters. This was a unique model of leadership, which for reasons of unity of command is usually hierarchic, with one only leader at each level of any given social organization. The main reason for this development lay in the family structure of the intimate group in which the male and female youth leaders were viewed by the youngsters as the group's father and mother. Love affairs between the youth movement leaders were quite common in the Polish ghettos. Movement to demand the economic, civil and political rights of women. In a more general sense, a set of theories that criticize the traditional condition of women and propose new relations between genders in the private sphere and a different social position in the public one.
Actually, it's impossible to name all the women involved in the Polish resistance struggle during the Second World War. There are too many stories of strong women died for their countries and their rights. However, we have chosen some female figures whose merits overcome their role into the Polish resistance, such as Tosia Eitman, Alina Margolis-Edelman, Wanda Wiktoria Poltawska, and Anna Kristina Zawiro. Tosia Eitman was born in Vilna in 1919. She was Jewish, and she's a meaningful example of resistance female figure. She represented the Hashomer Hatzair movement in the underground correspondence in Poland, becoming a symbol and a legend among the members of her movement in Palestine. She had been interested into politics and activism since she was a child. Indeed, in 1935, she attended the Fourth World Convention of Hashomer Hatzair as a delegate. In 1939, with the outbreak of war and the announcement of the evacuation of Warsaw, an appeal was issued for members of the youth movement to move eastward. Altman was instructed to return to the general government. There, she began to gather the remaining youth group leaders and organize the movement branches. She traveled from city to city, encouraging young people to social activities, even if she risked her life. In 1941, following the Germanian invasion of the Soviet Union, contact with the movement in Vilna was cut off, and so the Hashomer Hatzair leadership in Warsaw was responsible for the entire movement. Without context or information, Altman traveled to Vilna, where she proposed to the central leadership a return to Warsaw, but they refused. From the 18th to the 26th of March began the mass deportation from Lublin to Belzec. As a result, the leaders of the leftist parties organized an anti-fascist bloc. Unfortunately, the bloc soon fell apart. In 1942, the Jewish Fighting Organization was established due to the first wave of mass deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka. In this situation, Altman, as many other women, helped the organization by finding additional weapons and support. In 1943, the ghetto was surrounded by the German gendarmerie and the Polish police. As a result, the revolt erupted. The Germans began to systematically set fire to the buildings of the ghetto. Altman went out on rescue missions to retrieve fighters trapped in the burning sections of the ghetto. On the 24th of May, fire broke out in the attic where Altman and some comrades were hiding. She collapsed, and flames burnt her body. She died untreated on the 26th of May in 1943 due to her injuries. Alina Margolis-Edelman was another important female figure in the history of Poland. She was born in 1922 and she was a Polish physician, an Holocaust survivor, and a resistance fighter during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. That ghetto became the place of a confinement for the Jews of the capital and the province, and it was the spot of a massive protest that took place in 1943, ending up with a bloody Nazi repression. Edelman at first joining Doctors Without Borders, and then she helped participating in medical missions in Africa and the Middle East, Latin America and Eastern Europe. In 1990, she returned to Poland and began an association, Nobody's Children, to fight against child abuse in Poland. After the war, Alina graduated in medicine and married Marek Edelman, the legendary deputy commander of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The memories of Alina Margolis Edelman are unique in the grace of their simplicity. Her testimony as a child and adolescent tells us about the tragic heroism of the death and which she saved from oblivion. The third strong woman we have chosen is Wanda Wiktoria Poltawska. She was born in 1921 and she was a Polish psychiatrist, an activist and an academic. After the outbreak of the Second World War, she joined the auxiliary service and the resistance struggle. In 1941, she was arrested by the Gestapo and imprisoned in the castle of Lublin. After being interrogated and tortured, she was deported to the Ravensbrück concentration camp, where she was the victim of pseudo-medical experiments. Fortunately, she managed to survive the horror she suffered in the concentration camp, and in 1915 she graduated in medicine. Later, she became an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry of the Medical Academy of Krakow, a professor of Cultural Pastoral Care, and a therapist in the Department of Psychology. She conducted research on people who had been sent to concentration camps as children. In April 1969, she left the clinic to devote herself above all to marriage and family counseling. The last but not the least forceful woman is Anna Krystyna Zafiro. She was born in 1917 in Krakow and she was a Polish communist, represented in Polish People's Republic propaganda as the first leader of the Union of Youth Struggle. In the underground resistance, she was first involved with the youth group Spartacus, which had been organized before the war by socialists. But due to ideological conflict and irreconcilable differences, the group was dissolved in 1941. Then she became the co-leader of the communist publications Radio Bulletin, which from June 1941 printed communiques of Stalinist propaganda taken from Moscow radios. Under the occupation, the Union of Youth Struggle was chiefly responsible for propaganda in the paper Walka Mlodych, based in the Warsaw area. She was arrested by Gestapo and she was taken to Serbia prison, where she died in the night in 1943.
The path of Polish feminism, as well as the presence of women to Polish art, are so bumpy as to reflect the history of the country itself. The birth of the first women movements can be considered and placed in the 19th century, but to comprehensively understand the issue, it is necessary to frame it to a local context. Actually, we can say that the true origin of Polish feminism is connected to the struggle for national independence. Why? In 1918, Poland gained independence, and women were granted for the same rights to vote as men. Considering other European countries at that time, the situation of Polish women, especially the ones of the high society, was relatively better because they had to fill roles usually connected to men that were engaged in war at the time. Therefore, women had to take place in grounds traditionally male.
Dr. Jill Wistidianski makes studies on women, gender, and politics in international and global perspective. Our most recent research in this area focuses on women's movements and feminism in post-Soviet countries. She writes, during the years of partition and the two world wars, in addition to occasionally taking part in armed combat alongside men, women served mainly as volunteers, organizers, and educators, preserving cultural tradition, heritage, and the Polish language. Since these activities are far more extensive than the usual role of women, they reinforce the traditional position of them within society. A At the same time, the ideal woman was presented as the protector of the hearth and the house, and the educator of the younger generations, according to the spirit of national Catholic values. Another important element to take into account, according to Bistidionsky, is the following. The communist regime has bequeathed a profound distrust of achieving gender equality and feminism. On the one hand, state propaganda has successfully devalued the feminist cause and sowed an almost anonymous contempt for Western feminism, which was presented as a bourgeois concern of affluent, first-stated and primarily American women. On the other hand, during socialism, gender equality was taken for granted, although the facts proved otherwise. Therefore, women usually did not perceive how necessary feminism was, and many of them developed a real allergy to feminism. It was 2018 in Poland, when part of the country's female population, shocked, humiliated, and hungry, took to the streets again to fight in defense of fundamental human rights. The government project Stop Abortion, a real ban on abortion even in the case of serious birth defects, supported by the church and religion fundamentalists, had to be reviewed by the government at the time. However, the situation was already quite discouraging 2 years earlier, in 2016. On the 5th of July in 2016, it was proposed a total ban on termination of pregnancy, also establishing that in the event of abortion, both the women and the individual who carry out the procedure are punished. A mass movement against this law, called the Black Protest, immediately sparked spirits. The symbols of the protests were a black umbrella and a biohanger, a reference to the risky methods used in illegal abortions. The Polish nation was among the first to take a progressive stance on abortion. When women in Italy, Germany, and France protested for their rights in the 16th and in the 17th, legal abortion could already be practiced in Poland. Therefore, the Stop Abortion was a very rigid, retrograde, and anachronistic position taken by the Polish government. The limited access to abortion practices has actually allowed the birth of real support and help groups, and on this and on other occasions, the support of numerous more or less well-known artists in the country was also very relevant. For instance, in the streets of Szczecin, one of the most populated cities in Poland and a lively cultural center, the famous image of untitled Your Body is a Battleground by Barbara Gruger appeared, thanks to the work of the Center for Contemporary Art, which took care of posting posters throughout the city as a demonstration of resistance to the Stop Abortion ban. Barbara Gruger's original works recall the battles, the female ones, of which the body is the theater. A metaphor suggested by the foreground of a woman in black and white for one half, in negative for the other, and by the phrase your body is a battleground. Considered one of the most important American artists, as well as one of the most relevant women in the world, Gruger has denounced the female stereotype as overturned gender cliché, and her messages are entered our memory, in the past and in the present, with art and activism.